Welcome to episode 61 of the How to Japanese podcast. I'm Daniel Morales from howtojapanese.com, and it's February 2025. We made it. Otsukaresama deshita. We are currently 2 months from cherry blossom season, which marks the start of the decent weather in Japan, but it is cold right now. As I'm recording, it is 1 degree in Osaka and will be -1. That's Celsius, so right around 32, right around freezing. And it feels colder, to be honest. I mean, I lived in Chicago for 9 years. I knew cold, but for whatever reason, maybe because it was drier and it's more humid here, it feels really chilly. Could be the insulation, but man, you do have to try and soak it in right now, I think, because the summer is coming. And I don't know if you remember. I remember last summer. It was personally kind of scarring, traumatizing, and I know I started mentioning it every month on the podcast from about July onward about how hot it was. So I'm trying to kind of soak it up, take that coldness with me into the rest of the year. And it's cold. That means it's good indoor weather. We can be reading, we can be studying. If it's not too bad, we can go for a brisk jog. But fortunately, my municipal gym is literally a 2-minute walk away, and so I've been doing even some of my jogs indoors. If you don't go to a municipal gym in Japan, I really recommend it. It's a really interesting experience. It's usually pretty affordable. For me, it's just 600 yen a pop, and I buy a set of 10 passes, and that's usually my monthly gym fee for the month, and don't have to use it all within a 1 month period. But look around you. You might be surprised what's available. But even though it's been indoor weather, I have not made much progress on reading this new Murakami translation by J. Rubin, Into the World and Hardball Wonderland. I am sorry for that. I'm about a third of the way through it, but I got derailed earlier this year by a case of the flu in the first few days of the year. I think it was flu. I had a very faint positive test for flu A, and then the next day there was nothing at all, but felt basically like flu-like symptoms for the first 5 days of the year, which kind of threw me off. And I didn't really want to be reading. I wanted to be at 100% when I was reading that book. So I just kind of finished up my read of Parable of the Sower, which was a nice, great book, and also really easy read, which is exactly what I needed. And I had started it in December last year. So I finished the last 100 pages of that, and now I'm kind of back on my Hardball Wonderland business. And the other thing that I realized had languished, not just my read of Hardball Wonderland, but my Japanese reading kind of languished a little bit over not just this past month, but probably before that. I think, the last 6 months of the year, I was reading here and there little things, but I mostly was reading in English. And I run this monthly group called Translator Tuesday for SWET, which is the Society of Writers, Editors, and Translators. And one of the members who joined in the last couple months mentioned that she doesn't read much in Japanese outside of work because that's work. She said, literally, quote unquote, that's work. And I could kind of understand what she was saying. I spend most of my day reading Japanese, writing in Japanese, and listening to and speaking a lot of Japanese. So it can be nice to kind of take the pedal off the gas and do stuff in English, either reading in English. I play most of my video games in English. But it's important to know when you need to keep that pedal kind of pressed sometimes, and when you need to kind of shift up or shift down a gear so that you can go forward faster, right? Isn't that kind of counterintuitive? I guess you downshift to pass somebody on the highway. You need to kind of do that downshift to get into Japanese mood, stay in Japanese mood, speed up. And one of my Mercari pickups last year was a cache of books by this writer called Miyawaki Shunzo. I'll get that one more time. Miyawaki Shunzo. He was a Japanese editor and travel writer who died back in 2003, and he's known in particular for his books on train travel. I discovered him really randomly. I don't remember why I was on this particular Wikipedia page, but I was on the Wikipedia page for Saicho Katamichi Kippu. Did you parse that Japanese in one go? I'll give it to you one more time, slowly. Saicho Katamichi Kippu. That's Japanese for the longest one-way train ticket. And I think it's pretty easy to understand. Might sound long, but kippu, right? Saicho katamichi kippu. Kippu is the ticket. And saicho, longest length. Katamichi, one way. Longest length, one way ticket. And this is an idea that has a really, maybe surprisingly extensive Wikipedia page. It'd be surprising if you're not kind of familiar with how popular trains are in Japan. But if you know a little bit about how popular trains are in Japan, then maybe it's not a surprise. I'll link that Wikipedia page on the blog post this month. But it looks like people in Japan have done a lot of research into what this exact route is. What is the longest one-way train ticket that you can buy in Japan? And that means, in Japan, you pay for a ticket, you pay for the distance you travel on the rails. That's literally what they're calculating. And then you also have to pay on top of that. You might have to buy the express fee or the super express fee, which is the Shinkansen in often cases. But even when you buy a Shinkansen ticket, you're paying for that basic distance that you travel as well. And so there are restrictions on what exactly constitutes the longest one-way ticket. And the two biggest rules are that it must not do more than one complete loop if it ends up being a circle, and it can't double back on itself. Miyawaki wrote about this in his book, which is titled Saicho Katamichi Kippu no Tabi. So travel on the longest one-way train ticket. And I've been reading it for the last couple weeks. It sounds like he traveled for 2 months and rode the trains 13,267 kilometers in total from Hiroo Station in Hokkaido to Makurazaki Station in Kagoshima. I've read up to day 2 of his journey, and I'm finding it a really pleasant book to read. He writes really clean, straightforward Japanese, and each day is a chapter, and each chapter is divided into sections that often correspond to these smaller, short local train rides that he's taking. This makes it really easy to pick up and read a few pages each night, and that's always ideal, I think. Maybe it's this makes it really easy to pick up and read a few pages each night, and perhaps kind of ties in with a bit of the attention deficit that I've been suffering due to a continuing TikTok addiction. But I'm going to take it. If it's something that I can kind of keep up and maintain, I'm just going to roll with it and get that input when I can and where I can. Longtime readers and listeners of mine will understand once I learned about this book, I had to have it. I'm a train maniac and have taken some pretty epic journeys myself on the JR. When I was on the JET program in Nishihaizu, Fukushima, which is right in the middle, on the farther west side of Fukushima, so right in the middle of Honshu, basically. I rode from there with the Seishun 18 Kippu in about 24 hours all the way down to Kyushu, which involves catching the Moonlight Nagara in Himeji. So I would go west from Nishihaizu all the way to Niigata, basically, and then southwest along the coast through to Kanazawa and all the way down Lake Biwa towards Kyoto, and then eventually on to Himeji. And there was a bit of a break there, and I catch the overnight train from Himeji to Fukuoka the next day. That was a great trip. I also rode basically that same route back and forth to Kobe, and from Kobe I caught a bus to Tokushima to go to Awa Odori. That was one summer. And then I also rode back north from Beppu in Kyushu all the way up to the eastern coast of Fukushima, which was 30 consecutive hours on the JR, which was a great time. It's a fun time. It's a bit intense. Miyawaki's trip, each day is a little bit less intense than my kind of like extended trips, but he's clearly going on for a much longer period of time, a much farther distance, because you have to see the map that he created. Maybe I'll try and put a picture of it in the post. but it's kind of like going zigzagging all the way across Japan just as much as he can to get just as much distance as he can. That's really the only point. The point isn't to, I don't know, I think he enjoys the trip, but the real point of the trip is to get distance. And to do that, you're taking advantage of as many little local lines. You're going back and forth across Honshu, east and west, and then you'll go down a little bit east and west. And very interesting little book. I'm curious to see where it goes, and we'll try and report back on it. But I found a Mercari deal that included a bunch of his other books for a really good price, and the books all came with a little note from the seller, which I always love. Kind of saying, hey, this is a great connection, and thank you for buying it. Things like that makes me feel like these books went to a good home from a good home. But yeah, the point of me picking up this book right now is for me to push myself a little bit, because I was could feel myself thirsting for Japanese literary input. I've been doing lots of Japanese, like I mentioned, at work, but it's not the kind of challenging written literary Japanese that I think you need to do at scale for it to really have an effect on your language. I was reminded of this because my newsletter post this month is about a phrase I encountered in Murakami Haruki's travel memoir from Europe. If you've been reading the blog for a while, you should be familiar with this. This is a book called Toi Taiko, Distant Drums, and I've been reading it over the past couple of years for my annual Murakami Fest that I do on the blog in each September. One of the chapters I read last year, Murakami is riding a ferry in Greece, and he sees a Greek news report about Black Monday, which was the stock market crashed on a Monday in 1987, and it's one of the biggest crashes in history. And it's the first that he's heard of this kind of thing that's just happened, but it's literally all Greek to him. He's watching Greek news. He has no idea what's going on. But a guy on the ferry turns to him and goes, "Hey, Japan," because evidently the Japanese stock market also got hit pretty hard, and at the time Japan was an economic powerhouse. So Murakami doesn't really know what's going on. He sees the news. He can tell that something's up with the stock market, but it isn't until later that he learns what's actually happened. And here's how he describes that in Japanese. He says, "Ato ni natte wakatta koto da ga, それが例のブラックマンデーだった." I'll say that one more time. 後になって分かったことだが、それが例のブラックマンデーだった. And if you translate that into English, it's, I realized this later, but this was, as you know, Black Monday. The first clause of this sentence, when I read it, just kind of shocked me. I was like, what? That's Japanese that you can do? It makes so much sense, but it's not something I would have thought to create on my own. It's not a construction I would have kind of known inherently based on the Japanese that I've already learned to use and kind of recreate my own Japanese. And in the newsletter, I say that it triggered my collector's instinct. I think all students of foreign languages need to become collectors to a certain extent. For the first few years of learning a language, all you can really do is try and understand what you're hearing and seeing and then imitate it. So you're literally collecting phrases and then spitting them back out. But at a certain point, you start to move beyond this to gain a sharper appreciation between good Japanese and bad Japanese, efficient Japanese and inefficient Japanese, funny Japanese and serious Japanese. And you also gain the ability to create your own phrases, your own language, or grammatically correct language that you've never heard or seen before, but that is still grammatically sound. You move beyond imitation into creation. And at that point, you can kind of go through the Japanese that you've learned and begin to kind of cull your collection a little bit, throw out things that you don't need anymore that maybe you were using early on, and really kind of fine-tune your language, the catalog of language that you're using, right? Does that make sense? I think that makes sense. And as you develop this sharper appreciation, you need to kind of start to look for sentences that you can reuse. Look for sentences that are maybe to a higher standard now. And this is going to improve your foundations, expand your actively use, expand the Japanese that you're able to actively use, and kind of improve you and give you a voice, I think, which is something that's hard when you're first learning the language. This is how I felt when I saw that Murakami sentence. I immediately wrote it down in the Notes app on my phone. That's the kind of method that I use. And now this phrase lives there in a little note with a bunch of other phrases that I've collected from writing and podcasts and TV shows, things like that. The first step is developing that appreciation to realize, yes, this is an interesting Japanese phrase. And that's hard, like I mentioned. At first, everything is just new. And then once you've developed an understanding, that's when you gain that kind of ability to curate and collect. The second step is turning that recognition into action and saying, yes, I need to make a note of that. Yes, I need to take another step here and either write it down in a physical notebook or a digital app of some kind. So that's the next step. So the first step, realization. Second step, turning realization into action. And the third step is reviewing those words. And that also is a process of turning thought into action, reminding yourself, a reminder, right? That's something you're going to think, and then translating that actually into opening the app, opening the notebook, and then going through your words. So I've got this great list of phrases, but if I don't look at it, again, it's not going to help me. I need to get some repetition so that these go from passively recognized Japanese to Japanese I can use actively. And for me, I do that by setting a reminder each day that goes off at 7:20 that I need to check my Japanese words for the day. And I've been trying to also tie it to getting on the train every day. So if every day I get on the train, I open up my Notes app, that's going to get me to review those words more often and not play Pokemon Pocket so much. So now, after this nice kind of long-winded aside, let's look more closely at what's going on in this sentence. So that first clause, right? 後になってわかったことだが, right? It's got a conjunction before this next sentence, part of the sentence. The next part of the sentence is very straightforward. それが例の Black Monday だった。それが Black Monday だった is the basic part of that phrase. 例の is a kind of pointing to a shared, recognized item. So we all recognize Black Monday as that one specific Black Monday. 例の。それが Black Monday だった。That's the basic phrase. And then he's introducing it. 後になってわかったことだが。後になってわかったことだが。後になって literally means when it became later. It became later. 後になってわかったことだが。わかったことだが。Something I understood. It was something I understood. わかったこと。わかったこと。わかった is modifying こと。And then 後になって here is modifying わかった. So it's saying when did that understanding take place? 後になってわかった. 後になってわかった. So it's stating that the speaker, in this case Murakami, did the understanding after it had become later. 後になってわかった. And then using that whole bit to modify こと. So obviously that's not a very natural translation. That's what the Japanese is doing. That's the question that I'm always asking that I think is more interesting than translation. But a more natural translation would be something like, this is something I realized later, or even just, I realized this later, but. And this is a really natural pattern. I looked into it a little bit. I like to kind of see what's out there on Twitter. Twitter's a pretty interesting corpus of Japanese language. The internet, you can Google and really isolate things with quotes to kind of get usages. And one that I found was a diary from a new father, a random blog that I found that I'll also link on the blog post this month. And the father writes about a murder committed by a 12-year-old, apparently. I don't know. I don't know the actual news story, but he's writing about this murder, and authorities had found a drawing of Doraemon holding a dead animal, and they had theorized that the child was kind of like inherently violent, had these violent urges, and had drawn out this kind of violent drawing. However, the father adds this sentence. しかし、後になって分かったことだが、それは絵が苦手な少年の代わりに別の子が描いてあげた絵だったのだ。I'll read that one more time. しかし、後になって分かったことだが、それは絵が苦手な少年の代わりに別の子が描いてあげた絵だったのだ。So here, this writer is using the very exact same phrase as Murakami as a little bit of an aside. It's a really nice little aside. He could very easily say, しかし、それは何々々絵だったのだ. So you could say, however, this was this drawing that was given to this kid that was drawn by another kid for the kid who was not good at drawings. Except he adds this little aside. However, and they learned this later, or I learned this later, the kid was not good at drawings and someone else drew it for him, right? So it's not necessary in this case, it's a little aside, but it does add to our understanding. And so you can easily use this to kind of think up a little template for yourself, right? You could just say, 後になって分かったことだが、何々々でした, right? So, 後になって分かったことだが、Giants が勝ちました. So I realized this later, but the Giants won, or something like that, right? It's a pretty useful little phrase. You can use it as an aside, as above. You can combine it with a conjunction at the beginning of the sentence. Or you could just say it simply. It doesn't have to be this kind of 後になって分かったこと. You could remove that こと and very easily just say 後になって分かりましたが, I realized this later, but rather than this is something I realized later, right? So that's a very simple kind of permutation as well. 後になって分かりましたが、Giants が勝ちました. I realized this later, but the Giants won. And you can also use this phrase in reverse. I found some examples of this sentence is structured like 何々ということが後になって分かりました. So, Giants が勝ったということが後になって分かりました. I realized that the Giants won later. So it's basically just a similar way to do it, except Japanese is pretty kind of flexible. You can kind of move it around. It's pretty interesting. So one example sentence that I wrote up in preparation for this blog is, and you'll have to forgive the kind of English that I put in here, but this was like the first thing that came to mind. The Departed は香港の映画のリメイクだと後になって分かりました。The Departed は香港の映画のリメイクだと後になって分かりました. So I realized that The Departed was a remake of a Hong Kong movie after or later. And that's a reference to this excellent movie, Infernal Affairs, which if you haven't seen it, I would recommend it. I haven't seen it for like 20 years, and now I'm kind of like inspired to try and go watch it. Which also reminds me that when I first saw The Departed, I was kind of really let down by it because I had seen Infernal Affairs and it was so good, and even though The Departed is a pretty good movie, it just wasn't didn't have quite the same impact. So yeah, that's all just to say that this is a message for all of you listening. If you've been looking for some kind of inspiration, this is it, right? It's time to kind of shift into a lower gear and speed up. If you need that motivation, do it. Start taking notes. This is your reminder to kind of maintain a mindfulness as your, first to get Japanese input. You have to go out there and get Japanese input. And as you do that, you have to maintain a mindfulness that allows you to evaluate which Japanese you want to keep for yourself. And when you recognize that Japanese, you've got to write that down somewhere, and then you have to review it. So go out there, turn on the radio, turn on the TV, open a book, commit to a practice, whatever it may be, every day, and then keep that soft brain, keep that mindfulness that you need to recognize Japanese that can become yours, and then write it down and make it yours. Over at the newsletter, I've got 3 Iro links, the various links that I include at the end of the newsletter, and I thought I'd mention them real quick. The first is a TikTok video. TikTok went away for 12 hours, and that was a very sad time for me because I have a pretty intense TikTok addiction, I should say, and I managed to save all my favorite recipes and exercise videos and other kind of advice that that's kind of generally what I'm watching on TikTok. But I also saved this one that I thought was interesting from a guy who's learning Spanish, actually. And he said he started 3 to 4 years ago studying, and he sounds pretty good. It's funny, he switches from English to Spanish in the video and explains a little bit about his process. And I would go check it out. I would go listen to it because I think it's got some good advice. What it kind of comes down to is this: go out and talk to people. That's really the way you improve your spoken Japanese, especially, and is true for basically any spoken language. But don't just listen to me. Go listen to this guy on TikTok. I've got a link to it on the newsletter if you don't have TikTok yourself. And he recommends the app Hello Talk, and there's another one that might be for Spanish only, but Hello Talk I know works for Japanese as well. So give that a look. The other TikTok that I'd say keep an eye out for is this group of Japanese hosts that have gone viral for their kind of quirky dancing. And the main one seems to be a guy called Nishiyama, and he does this Nishiyama Daddy dance. It's pretty funny. It's interesting, and I'm so curious about it. I'm curious why there hasn't been more written about it yet, because it does seem to have kind of gone pretty viral. The only thing that I seem to be able to find online is this Know Your Meme site, which has a link to the Tyranno dance, which is actually one of the other hosts in this group of maybe like 5 or 6 hosts who seem to be based in Roppongi, and they all have their own kind of unique dances that they do. And the other hosts are kind of clapping and doing these chants behind them while they dance. And I think that it's a kind of weird overlap between, not weird overlap, I should say, overlap between Weird Japan, different kind of conceptions of masculinity, and then mainstream versus niche culture. And I'm so curious to hear what other people have to say about it. And I'm just kind of waiting for somebody to write about it because I haven't seen anything about it yet. And then the last link I shared is Jason Packman has a nice write-up of the 7 Lucky Gods Shichifukujin pilgrimage in Shinjuku, which I had no clue about. It seems pretty interesting, something you could do in Shinjuku that's maybe a little bit different from the norm. So go give those a look. Thanks for listening. That's the main content this month. Check out the newsletter and the blog. At the end here, I do want to put out a quick call for questions and comments. I'm looking to hear from readers and listeners kind of about what platform you're engaging with How to Japanese on the most. Are you reading the newsletter every month? Are you listening to the podcast every month? Are you checking out the blog every month, or just one of those 3 options? At the moment, platforms seem to be in a bit of a bad spot, I would say, in general. I like what I've built here on Substack and on the podcast and on the blog, but I'm not opposed. I'm not opposed really to moving elsewhere if I need to, even if it means making a somewhat substantial investment of time or money, because it's not nice to be sharing real estate with some of the people we're sharing real estate with on Substack. What do you make of the current content landscape? Are you trying to avoid Substack? Have you moved off of other social media platforms? My current status with social media is this: Twitter has become almost completely unusable. I've deleted it off my phone. I haven't deleted my account because I'm still confident that there is a future without its current owner, and it could potentially return to what it was, which was a very great place to connect for a long, long time. I'm only posting my monthly links there now. I'm not reading it. Threads and Facebook also, not a place I really want to be right now. I'm not using Threads. I'm posting my monthly links there. Facebook, I deleted it off my phone, but realized that I just run too many groups through there. Too many groups that I think are good, that are giving back, like my US Jetta Japanese reading group. If you're not a member of that, please do search for US Jetta Japanese reading group. Everyone is welcome to join. We read Japanese every month, and you're welcome to join us. And I realized I just need to be able to approve members. I need to be able to answer questions there. But I'm not, I turned off notifications, so I'm not using it really anymore. Mastodon, I wish I could train myself to use more of it. It's the closest thing to my Twitter of 2009 right now. It feels very intimate, nice little group of people in Japan that I follow. But the apps that I was using just aren't very good. It seems like they've gotten a little bit better in the last couple of months, so maybe I'll be on there a little bit. Blue Sky is the kind of social media where I'm most active right now, and I'm kind of posting there. So please do follow me there. Look for my links there. In terms of my writing, it's the same as it's always been. Once a month here on the podcast, once on the blog, once on the newsletter, and I've kind of developed a system to kind of link them all together. And I'm curious. I seem to get more comments on Substack on the newsletter than on the blog, but I wonder if that's kind of a function of the variation in content. I do most of my kind of focused writing on the newsletter these days, which is what I was doing for the Japan Times, what I was doing on my blog, maybe to begin with, although it was always kind of a bit more helter-skelter there. I've kind of started thinking and looking into the idea of self-hosting the newsletter, but the tech has really kind of gone to a different level in the last 20 years, and it isn't as simple as kind of putting up a WordPress installation, which to me felt like the Apollo missions when I first started blogging. But now would involve, it looks like, getting a new kind of server from my hosting company, and then also subscribing to a program that would send out emails called Mailgun. I don't know. Would you support a shift to a different platform? Like if I move to something like Ghost, do you know anything about setting up a Ghost installation, self-hosted or otherwise? It seems like it would at least involve another annual payment, which I'd like to avoid if possible, but or is it worth trying to kind of wait things out here on Substack? But this is mostly a labor of love, with the goal being to kind of pay it forward, all the support that I got when I was first starting to learn Japanese, because people were just incredibly generous with their time, and I'd love to help others find that same kind of support. But I'm not interested in supporting fascists and would really like to have my own digital real estate. So yeah, I mean, going back to the blog is also another option, and trying to find a solution with WordPress. But because that's kind of basically what things felt like for the first 10 years of writing it. So thanks again for listening. Thanks again if you made it this far, for letting me just kind of rant a bit there at the end. But I'm curious. I don't often do this kind of like audit of my writing situation, but I think it's important every now and then to kind of step back and see how things are going. But yep, thanks again, and we'll see you in March.